V for Vendetta is based on a graphic novel that was created in the early 80s. It was an English graphic novel done by Alan Moore and David Lloyd, and it was a really beautiful piece of art.
I, like God, do not play with dice and do not believe in coincidence. You may call me V.
V for Vendetta is in a class of its own. It's a brilliant piece of work. It's a commentary on society. And in the time that it was written, there was absolutely nothing being done like that.
Nobody had seen a character like that before. That sort of long hair and that funny mask and the hat. That was the strangest, weirdest character.
I was really impressed by its literacy, if I can put it that way, by the fact that, the hero V quotes Shakespeare and Bacon and Marlowe and has a marvelous, zestful use of language.
V was very unusual, and it was the first time I was aware of the phrase graphic novel. I had never really heard that before. And the graphic novel is immense.
It was so incredibly dense.
It really has raised the bar for the entire field and moved comics to a different place in the American popular culture.
And I think everybody was really excited by it. Everybody loved that story.
During the 1950s, there was really not much going on in comics outside of regular superhero, standard comics, aimed for an average male teenage reader.
Comics had a perception for a long time. They were viewed as junk. They really didn't have that much of a credibility. They were sort of viewed as just simply throwaway stuff for kids.
The guys who were drawing comics up to that point, it was a job. In the 30s and the 40s, if you could get into illustrating for Saturday Evening Post or something, those guys were stars. Rockwell was a star, Leyendecker, all these guys. And the guys that couldn't quite break that market, they'd get into comics. But, they would never say what they were doing. They'd go, I work in advertising or something like that.
American comics in the 1950s got a great deal of societal pressure and were accused of being responsible for juvenile delinquency, pretty much anything that was wrong in America at that time. And the way the publishers survived this pressure, they formed a self-regulating Comics Magazine Association of America.
All the work had to be read by the Comics Code authorities and approved by them and get their stamp of approval.
Create a little postage stamp. The Comics Code has approved this comic. Essentially said, this comic is safe for kids. By about 25 years into its existence from the mid-50s, the code had really started to not serve much of a purpose anymore.
We went through a period in the 70s that were very counterculture influenced, very cosmic. A lot of inner journeys and psychedelic comics that were still working in the superhero genre. In the 80s, things started to get grim and gritty.
I think Neil Gaiman used to say, Pal, Zam, Sacco. What's that? That's the sound of comic books trying to grow up. We were very proud of what we did. We were proud of the medium. We were going to try to have it be something bigger than what we were being defined as.
The only way you could actually do something interesting in mainstream comics back then was to take a character nobody cared about and say, yeah, go ahead, do whatever. Yeah, turn him into a frog, do whatever you want. We don't care. Nobody's reading this thing anyway. I'm amazed the most popular characters now are all the ones that we used to make fun of.
I guess there was a kind of snowballing of real sort of creative talent from the beginning of the 80s and towards the middle of the 80s.
British comics in the early to mid-80s didn't center around superheroes, which American comics did. That's all really American comics knew.
It was an incredibly fertile, wonderful, exploratory time where everyone in the business, we felt, wow, comics can do so much more and say so much more.
It was a unique moment where really there was this flood of new talent coming into this old established house. Some of the things, like V for Vendetta, were being published by smaller upstart companies that were more fragile.
I was working at the British division of Marvel Comics with an editor called Des Skin. Des left Marvel and set up his own magazine, Warrior. He asked me to create something. And so that's basically how V happened. The original idea was that I write and draw it. But the guy called Alan Moore, who's a very successful writer now, was on board at Warrior at the time.
It really wasn't until Alan Moore came along in British comics, particularly on V for Vendetta in the early 80s, that comics started to turn around. But only if you were aware could you really see that something was happening.
Alan's work was some of the first important creative work that was really done radically outside by a major publisher.
You know, he was one of the first people who decided, well, if I'm going to write comics, I'm going to write for myself, and I'm going to write for readers like myself, and there's no reason why it needs to be a children's medium.
Alan was writing, in a way, almost like novels. He laid out an incredible tapestry of intersecting lines and layer upon layer of ramifications and character development.
Just how elusive his writing was. That blew everybody away.
I thought it was a very good idea that Alan write this new character, because there was no way that I would have been able to introduce something that had the kind of depth that V ended up with.
There was also a very fertile political time in terms of what was being done. Comics felt like we were trying to break them out of a ghetto of perception.
The British comic writers of that period were very politicized. A lot of that was finding its way into the science fiction stories in particular that these guys were writing.
We wanted to do something that was not set in an old world. So the idea of setting it in the future England, where we could create any kind of background that we wanted because nobody knew what it would look like, seemed like an ideal situation. And then setting up some kind of tyranny, a dictatorship that was running the country, gave him a system to fight against.
They were projecting a world ahead and either saying it'll be utopian, dystopian, something in between.
The whole philosophy behind the story was partly stimulated because, you know, this was during the Margaret Thatcher era. It was an ultra-conservative government which was imposing quite heavy political rules on everyone.
The comic book was a political thriller. I mean, but it was a comic book with a superhero. V is a superhero. He's an aberrant superhero, but he is a superhero.
The original plan was for it to be a kind of urban guerrilla, and Alan really wanted something more theatrical. We came up with the idea of Guy Fawkes. So Guy Fawkes was a kind of early anarchist and a saboteur, and it seemed like a good idea to actually model the character on Guy Fawkes. Now, we created this story in the middle of summer, so there were no Guy Fawkes masks around, and I couldn't get one, and I didn't know where to find one, so I had to create one. And the thing about these Guy Fawkes masks is that they have a kind of eerie look. They have a look of a smile to them, and it made the character look bizarre and threatening at the same time, because the last thing you really expect from somebody who's coming to kill you is that he'd be smiling. From a visual point of view, I was concerned that a lot of people weren't reading comics who could read comics if they were given a chance to appreciate them in a different way. Sound effects is one thing. You know, wham, pow, zap, all that stuff. We're all familiar with that through the old Batman TV show, and it's become a cliche. And if you're intelligent enough, you know that if a gun's going off, you don't need bang. You can actually just show the fact that it's being shot.
When I first read it, it was like this, you know, this old-fashioned comic in the future. It was weird, and it was very modernist. I mean, it didn't have thought bubbles. It was all in captions. It was a really beautiful piece of art.
I was always concerned about thought balloons. You know, people saying, I think I'll do this now. I thought it was a good idea to make comics more like cinema and more like TV. And we're not aware of thought balloons in cinema and TV. And so he'd run it as a narrative in the background, and that happened very early on.
One of the unique qualities of V for Vendetta is the level of discipline that the creators chose to work under.
When I'd worked for other companies, I'd used big frames and then small frames, and I'd used open frames and stuff like that. A lot of the conventional things you can use in a comic. But that again, any kind of splashy layout in a comic will immediately put off people who don't usually read comic books. And again, that rectangle gives us the relationship with movies and TV.
And it was a black and white comic book. I mean, it's like a 30s movie. I mean, these were incredibly complex and interesting artwork. So to get a hold of them and read them was fascinating. And I thought they were literally storyboards for great movies.
There's a very film noir quality about David's artwork, absolutely.
In terms of the actual visual style of the actual artwork, it was going to be a very stark, bleak future that we were telling a story about. So the obvious thing to do was to use a very stark, bleak style.
It's a real retro future look to David's artwork. I think David's influence as an artist is from real classic British comic strip artists. It's not a comic booky look. He draws real people, and he's got a great graphic sense, a great sense of black and white.
Black and white art in comics can be extremely stark and evocative, and it tends to transport you more into almost a world that connects to editorial cartooning. You feel sort of the raw cartoon line much more in black and white than you do in color sometimes.
The original was in black and white, and people have asked me, about that, because a lot of people prefer it in black and white. I think the thing is that the reason why we did it in black and white originally was because that was all the printer could afford. The publisher could not afford to produce a colour book. If he had been able to, we would have used colour. I would have used colour. I would have liked nothing better than to use colour. I think everybody was really excited by it. Everybody loved that story. We were getting college kids and girls were reading this. We were actually getting people who didn't read comics reading them. So it was like a complete endorsement of the policy that we started out with. And then after 26 issues it finished. We hadn't finished the story, so it was stuck in a kind of limbo.
The magazine folded, and they were never able to do the last act of the book.
There was a part of it that was written, then there was a long break, and then it was like the, sort of greatest cliffhanger in, graphic novel history, I suppose.
There was nothing we could do about it. We both found other things to do while we looked for a way of finishing it. Towards the middle of the 80s, DC came over and invited a lot of us to come and work for them. They'd seen what we were doing in Warrior. They'd seen what the British creators were doing in 2000 AD. So they said, there's a bunch of really interesting, talented guys here, and they're not really being looked after, and we could use them for our books.
Karen came down the hall with some issues of Warrior where fragments of it had been published, and we were doing most of the American publishing of Alan's work by that time. She said, here's an opportunity to finish a story that was started, and why don't we take this on and make this something important?
I remember Alan was writing the end of Watchmen while he was writing the last new issues of V. So the profile in Viva Vendetta was pretty high, again because of Watchmen and because of Swamp Thing. So people ate it up, as they should. It's an amazing piece of work.
They did a very good job on it. It was finished, and it's become very successful. So we're happy that things turned out the way they did.
What I respect most about V for Vendetta is the completeness of its vision. The creative talent built their own scenario for what would happen in the world, what the dangers of that would be, and tied it together to history, politics, a specific geography, and really worked all the details together. There's a thoroughness to it that is extraordinary.